This is the Impressions Xchange podcast.
Impressions Xchange podcast,
where all topics impacting the graphic imaging and printing industry are addressed via in-depth news coverage, analysis, and timely interviews.
On this episode of the Impressions Xchange podcast, I catch up with 5 Printing United Alliance subject matter experts to find out what print service providers really need to know as we kick off 2025. Under a new presidential administration, there could potentially be some pretty significant changes that will impact the printing industry. Following our Printing Impressions January 2025 article, The Economic, Legislative, and Regulatory Outlook for 2025, Printing United Alliance experts Gary Jones, Vice President, Environmental Health and Safety Affairs, Sarah Osorio, Environmental Health and Safety Affairs Coordinator, Andy Paparosi, Chief Economist, Adrian Harrison, Vice President of Human Relations Consulting, and Stephanie Buca, Government Affairs Manager, join us to parse through the recent executive orders signed by President Trump, how to navigate federal versus state regulations, what the Alliance has planned in terms of advocacy, and how you can make sure you are up to date on all the latest regulations and legislation in 2025. Thanks for joining me, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Ashley.
Of course, it is such a pleasure. So I'm really excited to get into our discussion today. In our January issue of Printing Impressions magazine, we had this Overlook article, or Outlook article, I should say. They kind of, took a look at different areas that might impact or are going to impact the printing industry in 2025 and further. So I wanted to dive into it a little bit further with all of you. As a timely thing, I thought maybe first we could look at, what happened in recent weeks. So, the Trump administration has taken office, and Trump recently signed more than 20 executive orders, more than any U.S. president in history. So maybe we can start with that. Gary, can you talk about, do you foresee any of the executive orders directly impacting the printing industry? And if so, how?
Well, thanks, Ashley, for having us on. I guess my first observation is in terms of the executive orders, it actually is more than 20. I think now that it's been a whole week in office, I think total it's over 100 executive orders that President Trump has signed, either new ones or rescinding existing executive orders. And so, yes, there are some, I would say, at least I can speak more from the environmental health and safety area. There are some that are somewhat directly applicable and some that are more on the fringe. So on the executive orders that were signed that deal directly with environmental issues, those primarily dealt with greenhouse gas emissions, pulling the United States out of the Paris Accord, looking at the mandate for electric cars. And so those don't really have a direct impact per se on the printing industry, but more of an indirect impact in terms of ultimately, looking at delivery vehicles, for example, at some point in the future, you have to be all electric. So at this point, with that executive order in place, it's going to be a challenge because some of these executive orders, they're subject to pushback and scrutiny. As we saw, at least one of them has been taken to court over on the Department of Government Efficiency. So yes, an executive order does really drive a lot of actions by the federal government because the president is the boss and he's basically writing down the orders for all the agencies to follow. The one that I thought, and it's not unusual, the one that I thought had the greatest impact was the regulatory freeze executive order. And that's very common anytime you change administrations. Anytime a new administration comes in, they usually start with an executive order on regulatory freeze. They want to look at what's in the process, and do we really want to carry on with that regulatory program? And that executive order cuts across all of the different program offices, all the different regulatory offices, not just EHS. But to some extent, we are looking at as good news because there's some pending regulations that both EPA and OSHA were moving towards that we didn't particularly think were great. Like, for example, the heat illness prevention standard from OSHA, we believe that's now caught up in the freeze. we suspect, or basically the consensus is that's going to be withdrawn. And we came out in opposition to that, not because we don't want to protect our workers from heat illness. It's just that OSHA had proposed a significant amount of administrative requirements where you had a lot of record keeping and documentation that really didn't directly get to the protection of a worker. The threshold for applicability was 15 minutes over any 60-minute time period if you had a worker exposed to one of the two heat triggers, which are based on temperature. And so we did a survey of our members, or the survey of the industry, and we found that over 50% of the industry definitely were going to be impacted by this. In fact, the scenario that we played around with is that you think of a hot summer day in July, your air conditioner breaks and you have a maintenance staff that has to go up on the roof of the building to fix it. Well, if that maintenance person, they might be otherwise working in a completely air conditioned building, but if the maintenance work goes up on the roof to fix the air conditioner, they're up there for more than 15 minutes, very plausible scenario, the standard applies. And so the way that they structured that standard, they had a specific target in mind in terms of work group, but the way they did it is typical. What happens with OSHA is they cast the big net when they start to pull it in, they realize everything that they've pulled in with it. So we're opposed to that. There was EPA had proposed a nationwide air emission record reporting requirement for not just us but other industry categories. That has gotten caught up in the net, so to speak, of the regulatory freeze, and so there's a handful of those that were actually just another quick example. EPA's proposed what's called a multi-sector general permit, a revamp of their multi-sector general permit for stormwater discharges. So if you're a printing operation, you have to have a permit. They want to impose additional testing requirements. And so we don't think those are necessary. The record doesn't indicate that printers are a large source of contamination. And so therefore we're opposing that. We've actually asked EPA to withdraw that rule prior to the executive order. So we think that there's an opportunity here for some of these pending rules that we can work with the incoming administration, the new agency, and try to moderate the impact on the printing industry. So those, I think, will be some benefits from the executive order.
In your experience, or your expectations, how long does a process like this take to kind of go through, like when a new administration takes office and there's something like this that's on a freeze? Do you know, like, what's the timeline expectation?
Well, that's a good question, because we're still in the process of having Trump's designated personnel approved. So you have that. And then when you look at the way that this process works, is that the head of the agency is always approved by the Senate. And typically all the deputies below that head of the agency, and they have different names that are associated with them, those folks all have to also be approved by the Senate. So it takes a period of time to get the new administration and staff approved and then functioning and running. So I'm anticipating, in terms of the rules that were withdrawn, we're anticipating probably like a good 6 months, in terms of now the executive order is a 60-day. So they're supposed to review at the end of 60 days, but they may make a decision, hey, we're not going to move forward with that rule. If that's the case, then they may go back to rulemaking. So OSHA, for example, OSHA was pretty far advanced on their heat illness prevention. They may have to go back and repropose a regulation, and that would trigger the whole administrative review process. We would have a comment period. You may have a public hearing, and so that could be, it could be a year or even longer before a new rule would come out. But they have 60 days to make the decision. Then they need to determine what they're going to do. If it's going to be a tweak of an existing regulation, if the changes are within a reasonable amount of change, they wouldn't have to renotice it and repropose it for public review and comment. But if it's a significant change, they might start back from the beginning. So that's a tough one. It's going to be depending upon when they get all the new staff in, they get all the appointees in, and then what they decide to actually do with that regulation.
Right. Okay. So we'll stay on top of this, and I'll follow up with you in a couple months and see where we are. Very interesting. Yes. So, in the 2025 article, it was mentioned that there could be some pushback on states, for instance, in California, in relation to state vehicle emission standards versus federal standards. So, Sarah, maybe if you could talk about this. When it comes to federal versus state regulations, how do printing companies navigate that, especially, right now in a time of transition?
Yeah, so as Gary mentioned, we expect to see quite a bit of regulatory rollback, just like we saw with this first Trump administration. But that doesn't mean that there's not going to be a lot of state activity. In fact, this might push certain states to push for more regulation in certain places. So while the potential for relaxation might ease compliance at the federal level, state responsibility might increase. Um, as of 2025, there's 5 states that have EPR legislation. They're California, Colorado, Maine, Minnesota. So these laws and regulations are coming, and they're going to affect the industry. And beyond the state level, the EU also has regulations that might affect printers, especially in areas like EUDR, where there's going to be really strict due diligence with certain products and their derivatives. So even though there's going to be relaxation at the federal level, I think it's very important for printers to stay aware of the regulations in their state because there will definitely be action and activity at the state level.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Sarah, for those listening who might not be familiar, can you just tell us what's EPR and EUDR?
Yeah, so EPR stands for Extended Producer Responsibility, and extended producer responsibility is a type of legislation or policy that places the responsibility of end of life, of disposal, of recycling on the producer of the product. EUDR stands for the EU Deforestation Regulation or European Union Deforestation Regulation, which is basically, like I said, is going to impose strict due diligence on certain products. These include paper, paper, cattle, wood, leather, a lot of products that will affect the industry. And with that due diligence comes very, very strict supply chain management and even pinpointing the plot of land where certain products came from.
Interesting. Is that something that could potentially at some point in the future be implemented in the US, or is it kind of, I don't know, what's your...
Yeah, so I think the rule of thumb is anything that happens in the EU will eventually make its way here. With the Trump administration, it probably won't make its way here in the next 4 years, but we do expect that these sort of due diligence, it might not be exactly the same, but we do expect these types of policies to eventually make their way over to the United States.
Interesting.
Yeah, Ashley, let me add to that. There's a pending bill in New York State that's similar to the EUDR. So it isn't that, again, it's an example of what Sarah said is the states taking action where the federal government may not. So we will see, I think, some of that happening in the state level and not necessarily at the federal level.
Okay, great. So Andy, moving into kind of the, your area of expertise, you mentioned in the article that you plan to watch productivity trends most closely this year. Can you dive into that a little more? And what should print service providers be aware of and why?
Sure. Maximizing productivity. And again, not just in production or operations, but company-wide. Is no longer a luxury in our industry. It's no longer something nice to do. It's absolutely essential to sustained profitable growth. And that's because despite consolidation, our industry is getting more competitive, not less competitive, as boundaries between who does what, how, and for whom break down, letting everyone into everyone else's business. Our markets are simply too competitive to pass inefficiencies on to clients, and regularly making every single process from estimating to invoicing even a little more efficient is the foundation of sustained profitable growth. And there is a big difference between growing and growing profitably. And I'm very happy to report that many members of our Printing United Alliance State of the Industry panel get that already. There are some very, very encouraging results from our most recent State of the Industry survey. I'll share a couple with you. We asked our panel about their 2025 business priorities. Increasing productivity, cited by nearly 75%, and it's difficult to get 75% of this diverse group to agree on anything. Increasing productivity was by far the most widely cited business objective for 2025. We asked about capital investment plans. 63.3% plan to make a capital investment this year. They're not waiting for interest rates to come down. They don't want to fall behind. Their goal is to increase productivity, automation, and production speeds. Those are their top capital investment objectives. We asked about automation, and nearly 2/5, 36.6%, report that they, number one, have automated, and number two, automation has reduced the number of employees they require, both addressing labor shortages and boosting productivity. And what I found most compelling and significant was we asked about most desired investments. Now that's different. We didn't ask, where do you plan to invest? We asked, which investments would you most like to make? Sort of a magic wand question. If you could invest anywhere you wanted, which investments do you believe would most help your company? And it was very, very significant that more than 1/3, 34%, would most like to invest in artificial intelligence. Never, ever saw anything remotely close to that. And we ask this question every year. And that is very significant because it shows a growing recognition, at least among State of the Industry participants, that AI applications allow us to boost productivity in areas we could never boost productivity in before, automate activities we could never automate before, and enhance efficiency, productivity in every mission-critical function, from market analysis and forecasting to customer service to cybersecurity. So the goal, very laudable goal for 2025 across our State of the Industry panel, is to increase productivity. Now, I'll be watching, of course, who's making progress, because it's one thing to set a goal, it's another thing to actually achieve the goal. So I'll be watching very closely who's making progress toward the goal and how they are doing it by tracking metrics such as real sales per employee. And what we'll do, actually, is report the results in our State of the Industry reports, which, by the way, are generously sponsored by Canon USA, and in our new Key Financial Ratios program. So Alliance members, keep an eye on printing.org for updates to those reports. And just to kind of make this actionable, I'll just add a to-do. What I recommend is that every management team in our industry get together and ask, what are we doing to increase productivity? Pick one mission-critical function and ask, how can we make that function even a little more efficient? How can we eliminate even one more step, remove even a little of the friction? And most important, how can artificial intelligence help us do that? And anyone who asks those questions and answers them honestly is building a competitive advantage that will help them excel, not just in 2025, but far beyond. So that's what we'll be watching and why.
That's really interesting. So, do you have any sense of, that I might be wrong on the percentage, but you said 35% said AI. Was it 35 or 30?
34, close.
34.
Yeah, in the
Okay.
ballpark. Yeah.
Almost there. So 34%. Do you have any sense of where those people are in kind of that funnel of, are these people who they're interested in investing in AI?
Right.
Are these people aware of the possibilities of AI, what they can do? Are some of these people just, because right now everybody's talking about it.
Right.
So there's a lot of interest, but maybe they don't know how
Right.
to utilize it for
Right.
productivity.
Very good point. Very good point. And yes, for about a year, well, more than a year, we've been tracking this in State of the Industry, and we've been asking progressively deeper questions about exactly what you just asked me. How exactly are you using AI? Where are you with it? And yeah, some of them are still mucking around with ChatGPT and Grammarly, which is good, but the majority of them are quite advanced.
Mm.
They're using artificial intelligence for market analysis, trend analysis, forecasting to get a better picture of where their company is, what's happening internally, what's likely ahead internally and externally. And that gives them a huge advantage. They're getting a clearer picture of what's happening, what's expected, what's likely, and why. And they're using it in risk management.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the things State of the Industry panel members learned from the last 3 years, particularly the supply chain disruptions and all the disruptions COVID caused, was that you can never be too strong or have too effective risk management. So they're beginning to use AI in risk management.
Mm-hmm.
It can be very effective there, in cybersecurity, in data security. They're managing people's data like a bank does. They have to make sure they have the kind of security measures a bank does. And pretty much everything from, again, operations all the way through customer service, all the way through very, very advanced analysis. And that's what we tried to do with State of the Industry is, again, to your point, motivate people not to rush into this, Ashley, because it's complicated and there are significant risks to it,
Mm-hmm.
but motivate them to be thinking about it and learning about it, because that's where you have to be.
Right. And when you mentioned data security, that
Yeah.
was one of the first things that
Yeah.
I think about with AI is, are the potentials of, is it secure?
Yeah.
It's,
Sure.
especially for someone like me who doesn't totally understand it.
Mhm.
So that's a really interesting
Yeah.
point.
No, it's really fascinating what I've read about what it can do in data security and risk management, how it anticipates potential data breaches.
Mm-hmm.
And as I say, the objective is to educate our members on this and have them be thinking about it and learning about it.
Right. Right. No, that's wonderful. Thank you for that.
Mhm. Thank you.
So moving into kind of the government affairs side of things, Steph, one of the biggest concerns that we've heard from our audience members is in the direct mail space, the rising cost of postage and how that's impacting their customer base. So can you tell us anything about the advocacy the Alliance has planned on behalf of the industry on this topic?
Thanks for the question, Ashley.
Yeah.
So it's funny, we're shifting from AI to talking about a 250-year-old institution, the U.S. Postal Service. So the concerns are valid, and the rate hikes, to give you a little background on this, there have been 6 rate hikes since August 2021. And last July, the average hike was 7.8%. Now, they did decide to forego a rate increase this month, which was welcome, but this July, there will be another rate increase. So the other concern, the service delivery and delays. So for those of you that aren't aware, the Postal Service decided to lower their performance targets. And what they decided was they will deliver regular cards and letters slated for 2-day delivery on time, just 87% of the time, compared to their goal last year, which was they were going to try for 93% of the time. So it's almost, they lowered their targets so they can meet the targets. And let me tell you, Congress is not happy. They are very upset with DeJoy. Committees, DeJoy came before the House Oversight and Accountability Committee and the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. They basically drilled him and just, said, we don't believe your 10-year, it's called the 10-year Delivering for America plan. We don't think this is working. And so there's a big divide between the Postmaster General and Congress. So the financials are, DeJoy planned to break even by 2023. However, they lost $9.5 billion last year, and they're expected to lose $6.9 billion this year. So it's understandable that, after the Postal Service Reform Act passed and Congress gave them a lot of money, they're still, really struggling. And so we are advocating on two fronts. One is through legislation, and there's an act. It's called the USPS Serves Us Act. And what this would do is give more power to the Postal Regulatory Commission to ensure that the Postal Service is being held accountable for their service and efficiency. So the Printing United Alliance supports this legislation. And once it's reintroduced and gets a bill number assigned, we will send out an action alert. And we encourage anyone to take action and send a letter to their member of Congress, urging them to vote in favor of this bill. And on the second front, there's direct lobbying going on. So one of our coalition partners, C21, they've been meeting with senators to talk about, basically find out what their perspective is and to sort of set the stage for what we would like to see happen, because we need an affordable and reliable postal service. That's what we're advocating for. And finally, I just will say that there's been some talk about privatization. And we're open to learning more about what that would look like. There are different forms of privatization. It could be a public-private type of model. So we're not necessarily opposed to it, but we need a little more analysis on that. Trump's team has indicated that they might consider privatization. So it's something that we'll keep in mind as things progress. But overall, we are on Capitol Hill advocating to keep the Postal Service up and running in an efficient manner. And we'll just continue to do that. For more information, I encourage you to go to printing.org and visit the Advocacy Center.
Great. Thank you for that. And yeah, shortly after what was shocking news to me, maybe not shocking to other people, but when Royal Mail in the UK was privatized, I don't know, month or so ago, editor emeritus Mark Michelson wrote a piece shortly after that on Printing Impressions about the potential of that and what that might look like. So
that is something we can consider, right? We can look to Europe to see, what has happened there and as an example and do some analysis there. Yes, definitely.
Yeah, so thank you. So last but certainly not least, Adrienne. So in the article, you touched on a few of the HR issues to pay attention to this year as we move into new presidential administration, as we move into a new year. So what would you advise print service providers to pay closest attention to in order to ensure that, they're compliant, they're up to date on everything? What do you think?
With regard to labor and employment laws, the executive orders, the flurry of executive orders that were issued very quickly in the new administration, only somewhat touch on our industry with regards to labor and employment. One important thing to know is if you are a federal contractor, and there aren't a lot of printers that are federal contractors, but there are, some. So if you are a federal contractor, DE&I programs are no longer allowed. So you have to be very cautious. You need to dismantle an official DE&I program and then be very careful how you proceed. Any affirmative action programs in federal contracting space are going to be scrutinized and you may lose a contract. This does not apply to veterans and disability affirmative action programs. Those are still allowed, but it does apply to race, gender, gender identity, and things of that nature. So that's an executive order that came down immediately, and that needs to be respected. With regard to the outlook with labor and employment, it is insanity how much you will have to pay attention to. So in the federal government, the Department of Labor is one arm. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is another arm, and the National Labor Relations Board is the third arm. All three of them are going to it's like a three-pronged approach to labor and employment laws, and all three are going to have a lot of activity. In addition, because of, as I think Gary mentioned, there will be no new regulatory actions and a lot will be pulled out. The states always become much more active when the federal government is steps away from regulatory action. So there'll be a lot of activity in the states that'll need to be paid attention to. And of course, we at the Alliance will be very cautious to make sure we let you know what's happening as it affects you. But I will say, I'm not going to traffic in rumors until there's actual things happening. I'm not going to report on them because it's crazy out there. So I would say things to be careful of are your gender identity programs. And if you have a DE&I program, you have to be careful because outside of the federal contractor space, these are still under the EEOC guidelines appropriate. However, the Trump administration has deemed them illegal. And without defining what illegal means, and as we sit here today, the guidance hasn't been changed. There will be changes, and we need to be responsive to that. So we want to make sure we're not doing anything illegal under the EEOC. The Democrats will control the EEOC until 2026 because these are people who are appointed for a term and they roll off the commission. And so until 2026, it'll be Democrat controlled. So that'll be a slow roll.
Okay, so this is a little interjection here into our full episode. So when we originally recorded this a few weeks ago, we knew things were changing rapidly, but since recording, there's actually been another update with the EEOC, which Adrian had just spoken about. So Adrian, I have you back here. Can you give us an update from what the listeners just heard to now?
Sure. Hilariously, I think that the actions I'm going to talk about may have been happening while we were recording the podcast. It's that fluid of a situation. But just to update everybody on the EEOC, here's what happened, and it is of some significance. The president fired the two of the commissioners on the EEOC. There are 5 commissioners. 1 seat was empty. 3 were occupied by Democrats, 1 by a Republican. 2 of the Democrats were fired. This has never happened. It is not common. In fact, it's unprecedented. It has never happened that anyone has fired EEOC commissioners. The general counsel was fired as well, but that's expected and that is more common. And so that wasn't a surprise. But firing of commissioners has left the commission with 2 commissioners, which means there is not a quorum and that they cannot do any kind of significant business without a quorum. It also means that, unlike what I just said in your recording, that the Republican control and the Trump agenda will be dominant in the EEOC as soon as he appoints new commissioners, and that will be imminent. At the same time, he made one of the commissioners, the Republican, the acting chair. Her name is Andrea Lucas. She has issued a statement almost immediately upon her appointment that said that basically the commission is focusing on harassment of women, and in keeping with the administration's goals is rolling back protections in the areas of gender identity. There are others, I'm sure, that are going to get less attention as well, but gender identity, they are not protecting anymore. When I say they, the EEOC is not going to be protecting anymore. And so they are changing the harassment guidelines, which are relatively new, to reflect that gender identity is not going to be protected. In addition, they have made a point of stating that separate spaces for biological females need to be at private companies, period, end of story. So you cannot have a bathroom, a woman branded bathroom that transgender women are allowed to use. So it does not mean, however, that you can't have a third choice, like a family bathroom or whatever, just a standalone restroom that can be used by anyone who wants to use it. And Ashley, you and I talked about this last year in a podcast, I think,
Right.
where in airports there's a family bathroom. It's usually has disability access and it's large, and that sort of thing is available as an option as far as we know. So if you did have a transgender or more than one, any transgender workers in your building, having a bathroom that is gender neutral is still available as an option, as long as you have a protected, safe space, quote unquote, for biological females.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you for updating us there.
Sure.
We're recording this in early February, but I do definitely urge anyone who's listening right now, because things are changing so rapidly, keep an eye on printing.org, anything coming from our subject matter experts, especially if you're a member of the Alliance, and also keep an eye on Printing Impressions newsletter. We'll try to, if there's anything that we can update you on, we'll try to do that. But yeah, definitely wanted to keep in both versions of what was happening, just to highlight how things are changing and how important
Yeah,
it is to keep up to date.
it's a fast and furious bunch of activity in Washington these days, for sure.
Yeah.
Interestingly, the nominee for Department of Labor Secretary is Lori Chavez DeRemer, and she is one of only a handful of Republicans who voted in favor of the PRO Act, which is a union-friendly legislation that was proposed in the last Congress. So the National Labor Relations Board it's going to be very interesting what happens there, because generally, all of a sudden, all these memos that have been issued will be revoked and new memos will be issued with a different bend. I would suggest that we will have a new look at the overtime rule that is the Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division overtime rule that was retracted because of lawsuits that were filed when they escalated the wage thresholds. There'll be a new rule that comes out under the Trump administration that's going to take about 2 years to roll out, probably. That's my guess. This is all speculation, of course. And there will be activity in the world of non-competes, which was a hot button that went back and forth, as did the joint employer rule. And I think how it's going to shake out is that non-competes are going to be allowed. Right now, they are presumptively illegal based on a memo from the Jennifer Abruzzo, the General Counsel of the National Labor Relations Board, but she is going to be fired soon. And so that memo will be withdrawn. I do believe in a narrowly drawn non-competition agreement will be allowed during these next 4 years. And then other than that, on the daily, like minimum wage laws are going to change, but our printers already exceed the minimum wage. And so as starting salary, so I don't think that'll affect a lot. And of course, I listen intently to what Andy has to say, because every bit of economic policy and automation and AI affects our workforce and the number of people we need to hire and things of that nature. So track Andy's information carefully, because then we will be able to draw conclusions, or at least knowledgeably speculate about what the fallout will be in the labor and employment world.
So, excuse my ignorance here, but when you said, in relation to DE&I, that
Yeah.
and use the word illegal. So would that be, is that only for, obviously, I know federal agencies that's being cut. And you said, printers who work with federal contracts. Does that apply to like private companies if they have DE&I program? Is that illegal in that sense, or is that doesn't?
Not officially, not yet. But the words that DE&I programs are illegal have been stated, I believe, by the president himself. And so as a result, we should anticipate that that the administration will force the EEOC, which is the arm that enforces these discrimination laws, will force the EEOC to withdraw its guidance that says that at a very minimum, that gender protections are covered under Title VII of the 14th Amendment. That is based on a Supreme Court case called Bostock. So I don't know. There's a very interesting tripartite government action thing happening here. And I really don't know how much power the executive branch will have to they certainly can withdraw the guidance, but as far as
Enforcing, right? That's what
it'll be interesting because again, enforcement is also an executive branch function. However, the Supreme Court has already spoken on this issue and said that these are protected characteristics. So I don't know if I've answered your question because it's really hard to answer, but this is where we are right now.
Okay, so something to pay attention to as we
Yeah.
as we move forward. Okay, well, thank you so much for that. Before we close out, is there anything anyone would like to add? We didn't talk about, wanting to get into something else.
I'd like to say that it's going to be a very fast changing environment in every aspect of government regulation and legislation, but in particular, how regulations are either not enforced or withdrawn, and how executive orders are going to be challenged. There's going to be so many lawsuits. It is really going to be a minefield for at least the first year of the administration, possibly much longer than that. So I would say just pay a lot of attention, visit our web pages, pay attention to our newsletters and statements on these issues and various updates that we will be providing regularly on all of the activity in the federal government.
Right. And I will in the description link to our web pages. Gary, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I wanted to just on the regulatory front in general, if we look at what happened under the first Trump administration, which pretty much we've heard him say, we haven't seen it yet, but basically what he's telling the agencies is that every time that you want to put out a new regulation, you have to take 2 off the books. And what happened under the first administration, it really ground a lot of regulatory rulemaking to a halt because of that requirement. And there was some movement in that area to reduce and streamline some of the regulations. And I think that actually really reiterates what Sarah was saying, is that you really got to be paying attention to your state. And another great example of that, I mentioned the heat illness prevention that federal OSHA was looking at proposing. Well, what's happened now in at least 7 states, and I think there's one pending now in Virginia, but 7 states have passed their own version of the heat illness prevention. So even though I mentioned at the federal level that there may or may not be a regulation, I suspect there probably will be, or at least guidance coming out. Whether or not the issue, because if they have issue regulation, if they have to take 2 off the books, that could be kind of tough. But there is a lot of pressure by labor to get a nationwide heat illness prevention regulation on the book. So it's going to be interesting to see how that unfolds. But if you're in one of the states that has an existing regulation, you need to follow that because it's a state mandate. So what happens at the federal level? Understand if you are in one of the states where they're taking action, then you need to make sure you're following that particular state requirement. So we'll try to remind our members, along those topics if those questions come up, if they're in one of those states, and that changes, as Adrian said. We put out a lot of information through many different channels, through the association, through the NAPCO media channels, to try to keep the industry and most specifically members up to date. And then most importantly, if you're a member of Printing United Alliance, you have access to everyone that just spoke today on the podcast. You can pick up the phone and call us. You can send us an email. If you have a specific question for your company and something that impacts your operation, you reach out to us. That's a huge benefit and a value of being a member of Printing United Alliance.
Gary, thank you for that. Thank you for closing it out with a really great call to action for all of our listeners. And I will include links to printing.org and each of the individual pages mentioned here. So thank you all so much for joining me today. This was incredibly informative, and I'm sure our audience members will agree.
Thanks, Ashley.
Thanks, Ashley.
I want to thank Gary, Sarah, Andy, Adrian, and Steph for joining me on today's show. I will include links to all of the pages mentioned on printing.org. I also want to thank all of you, our listeners. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Impressions Xchange podcast.